I have been called, at various points in my life, the coldest man in England. My solicitor said it first, when I was 19 and negotiated my father's creditors down to the last penny without flinching, sitting across a table from 3 men twice my age, and speaking to them in the level, unhurried tone I had already learned was more effective than anger. My officers said it later during the Iberian campaigns, when I ordered a tactical retreat while 2 of my men still lay in the field, a decision that saved 40 lives and cost me 2, and which I replayed every night for a year without showing anyone that I did, because showing it would not bring them back and would only make the men uneasy. My mother said it most recently, 6 months before she died, sitting in the large chair by the south window of her dressing room, looking at me with the same dark eyes I had inherited, and the same unsparing assessment I had always privately respected. "You have built a wall around yourself, Edmund," she said, in the low, direct way she had. She had never in her life adjusted her tone for the comfort of her audience. "And one day you will look over it and find the world has gone on without you." She was, as she was in most things, entirely right. I am Edmund Aldrich Carow, the Duke of Varnmore. I am 38 years old. I command one of the 3 largest landed estates in the northern counties, a fleet of merchant vessels on the Atlantic trade, and the unqualified fear of every minor lord within 40 miles of Varnmore village. I have a study full of accounts that I manage with precision, a moor that I walk in the early mornings with something approaching pleasure, and a household of 16 indoor servants who run the place efficiently and address me with the particular deference that comes from knowing that their employer sees everything and forgives nothing that is careless. I am also, as of the 14th of October in the year of our Lord 1831, a married man married to a woman I did not choose, did not know, had never met, and had vowed in the most solemn terms I could devise to leave entirely alone. I broke that vow before the night was over. This is the account of how it happened. I tell it now because my son Thomas asks, and because he is 12 years old and beginning to understand that the story of how his parents came to be together is not a simple one, and because he deserves the truth of who his father was before his mother changed him. I tell it without flattering myself, because the man I was at the beginning of this story does not deserve flattery. The woman I married deserves better than a prettied-up account. Her name was Lydia Renworth. She was the second daughter of Sir Aubrey Renworth, a baronet of modest estate in Shropshire whose fortunes had been declining for 15 years, and had in the past 2 arrived at something very like ruin. The kind of ruin that does not announce itself in a single dramatic collapse, but seeps in gradually, through bad harvests and worse investments, and the slow erosion of the sort of genteel optimism that cannot quite bring itself to read the accounts clearly. I knew none of this when I agreed to the arrangement. I knew only what my solicitor, Pemberton, laid before me on a gray morning in September, in the careful, measured language of a man who has been delivering uncomfortable news for 30 years, and has refined the art of making it palatable. That a match could be contracted which would settle certain outstanding claims against the Varnmore estate, claims that had arisen from my late father's more reckless investments in the years before his death, and that the Renworth family had a daughter of suitable age and satisfactory character who was, in Pemberton's measured phrase, unlikely to make demands. I asked 3 questions. Is she of sound health? He believed so. Is there any legal impediment to the match? None. Is the family in agreement with the arrangement? They were eager, he said, with a tact that barely concealed what eager meant in this context. They were desperate, and a duke was their way out. I said, draw up the papers. I did not ask her name until the morning of the wedding. I am not proud of that. I set it down plainly because it is the truth, and because the woman who answered to that name deserves to have the record show, with complete accuracy, what she walked into and what she made of it entirely by her own effort and character. The ceremony was held at the estate chapel at Varnmore on a Tuesday with 8 people in attendance. Pemberton, my steward Croft, 2 household witnesses whose names I have remembered ever since with a gratitude they did not know they were owed, Sir Aubrey Renworth, his wife Lady Renworth, their elder daughter Cecily, and Lydia herself. I stood at the altar in my dark coat, the one I wore for serious occasions, and waited. When the door at the far end of the nave opened and she walked in on her father's arm, I turned and looked at her for the first time. She was not what I had expected. I do not know what I had expected, some pale, frightened creature in a borrowed gown, I suppose, already flinching at the edges of her composure. already performing the gratitude that was expected of a woman whose father was selling her to settle his debts. Instead, she was composed. She wore a dress of soft ivory wool, plain-cut and well-made, without ornament beyond a single strand of small pearls at her throat that caught the light when she moved. Her hair was a warm chestnut brown, pinned in a simple arrangement with 2 curls escaping at her temples in a way that suggested she had attempted, and then released the effort of perfect tidiness. Her face was, I noticed this before I noticed anything else about her, entirely steady. Not blank, not braced, not smiling with the desperate brightness of someone performing happiness for the benefit of witnesses. Steady. The way a candle is steady in a room without drafts. Her eyes, a clear gray, moved to mine as she reached the altar, and she held the look for a moment without flinching or looking away, in the manner of someone who has decided to look at what is in front of her and simply deal with it. I felt something then that I could not immediately name. Not attraction, not yet. I was too well armored for anything so definite to arrive so quickly. Something closer to recognition. The expression on her face was one I knew from the inside. The expression of a person who has been placed in an untenable position by circumstances entirely outside their control, and has decided, in the privacy of their own mind, to meet it with whatever dignity they can manage, and has decided this without complaint and without visible effort, because the decision has been made, and what remains is simply the doing of it. I had worn that expression myself for the better part of 20 years. The vicar spoke. We made our vows. The ring, my mother's, a plain gold band with a small sapphire set flush into the metal, the only genuinely good decision I had made in this entire affair, went onto her finger. She said, "I do," in a clear, quiet voice that did not waver. I said "I do" in the clipped, formal tone I used for signing documents. Sir Aubrey wept, which surprised me considerably. Lady Renworth did not, which did not. Afterward, in the vestibule, while Pemberton managed the paperwork, and the witnesses shifted about in the particular awkward manner of people who have fulfilled an obligation, and are uncertain whether they may leave, I drew Lydia aside. She stood quite straight and met my eyes with that same equanimity. Up close I could see that she was perhaps 22, with fine features that were striking rather than conventionally pretty, a determined jaw, a mouth that suggested she was not in the habit of leaving things unsaid, a small scar at her left temple in the shape of a crescent that I would learn later was from a childhood fall from a pear tree. "I want to be honest with you," I said. "I would appreciate that," she said, without any particular inflection that would tell me whether she expected honesty to be favorable or unfavorable, simply that she preferred it to its alternative. "This marriage was made for practical reasons on both sides. I intend to honor it in every legal and material sense. The full weight of the title, the household, the allowance that Pemberton has outlined. You will have the use of Varnmore House and its resources, and you will want for nothing that money can provide." She said nothing. She waited in the manner of someone who can tell that the sentence has more to it. "What I am not in a position to offer," I continued, "is the kind of marriage society considers usual. I will not perform domestic happiness I don't feel. I will not pretend a closeness that does not exist. I have a wing of the house, the study, the library, the north corridor, that is principally mine. You will have the family apartments in the east wing. We will appear together at such occasions as require our joint attendance, and I will be," I paused, searching for the word that was accurate without being brutal, "civil." "Civil," she repeated. Not with bitterness, not with sarcasm, not with anything that would tell me she had been wounded by it. Just testing the word, the way you test the temperature of a room when you enter it. "Yes." She was quiet for a moment. The sounds of the vestibule went on around us, Sir Aubrey blowing his nose, Pemberton's pen on the documents, the cold wind finding a gap under the chapel door. Then she said, "And if I find that arrangement disagreeable, you may tell me so. And then—" I considered, "And then I will listen." She looked at me for another moment with those clear gray eyes, and I had the unsettling sense that she was taking the measure of me very precisely and with considerable accuracy, and was arriving at conclusions she was not prepared to share. Then she nodded, a small, composed inclination of her head. "All right," she said, "civil." She turned to greet Pemberton, who was approaching with the signed documents and the particular expression of a man who considers himself to have managed a complicated matter efficiently. And I watched her go, watched the way she moved, the straightness of her back. The way she received the papers from Pemberton with a gesture of such natural self-possession that he unconsciously gave a small bow he had not intended. And I felt, beneath all my armor, the faintest twinge of something that might have been shame. The wedding supper was a modest affair at the long dining table in the main hall, lit by 24 candles in the chandeliers, and the last gray light of the October afternoon coming through the tall windows. The supper itself was better than the occasion deserved. Cold pheasant, a saddle of venison, a soup of leeks and cream, and a very good burgundy that Croft had been saving for an occasion he considered worthy, the selection of which I chose to interpret charitably. I sat at one end of the table and Lydia sat at the other, and we spoke almost not at all to each other through the meal, but I watched her, not obviously. I have 20 years of practice in observing rooms without appearing to do so, and I saw things. I saw her speak with Croft with genuine interest, asking him something about the estate that I was too far away to hear, and Croft answering with a warmth in his manner that he reserved for people he had decided were worth talking to. I saw her laugh once at something Pemberton said, a real laugh, brief and unguarded, and Pemberton, who is not a man who produces laughter easily, looked pleased with himself. I saw her manage Lady Renworth's thin, watchful conversation with a patience that I found quietly impressive, responding with attention to remarks that did not particularly deserve it. Her sister Cecily sulked into her wine glass throughout the meal and looked at me periodically with an expression somewhere between resentment and calculation, which I filed and set aside. After supper, I excused myself, as I had planned to do, citing a state business that required my attention. Pemberton gave me a look that I chose to ignore. Croft kept his face entirely neutral, which with Croft is a form of eloquence that I have learned to read over 15 years of working together. I went to my study, lit the lamps, and sat with a glass of brandy and the accounts for the Whitby shipping concern, and I told myself I had handled the matter with appropriate efficiency. That the arrangement was clear, the terms were fair, the papers were signed, and the woman in the East Wing would find herself provided for and free of undue pressure from a husband who had no intention of imposing himself on a life she had not chosen. That this was, in fact, the decent outcome. That someone had to make these arrangements, and I had made mine more carefully than most. I managed this belief for approximately 2 hours. At 11 o'clock, I set down the accounts and admitted to myself that I had not absorbed a single figure in the past 40 minutes. The Whitby numbers were in front of me, and I could not have told you what any of them said. I poured a second brandy, which I did not drink. I stood at the study window and looked out over the moor, which was silver under a 3/4 moon, the sedge standing in the frost like small silver torches. The moor is the thing about Varnmoor I actually love, the only part of the estate that is not managed, not productive, not organized for any purpose, just present and enormous and entirely indifferent to anything I might require of it. I come to it when I need to think, which is most mornings. It has never given me a bad answer. What it gave me now was the awareness that I did not know a single thing about the woman in the East Wing. Not her name until that morning, not her history, not what she had been doing before this arrangement was made, or whether she had wanted to be doing something else, or whether she had been happy in Shropshire in the way that people in small market towns with stable social networks can be genuinely happy even when they are not prosperous. Not whether she had been engaged before, or courted, or whether she had anyone she was leaving behind. Not whether she found the northern moors alien after the soft hills of Shropshire. Not whether she read, or rode, or drew, or played, or had views about anything at all, and that last point, given the 2 exchanges I had observed between her and Pemberton and between her and Croft, seemed increasingly unlikely to be an absence. She had answered me in complete sentences with evident thought behind them. She had said, "I would appreciate that," when I offered honesty, and the word appreciate had the weight of someone who had experienced its opposite. She had asked what would happen if the arrangement was disagreeable, and the question was not a performance of resistance, but a genuine request for information about the landscape she was entering. She had looked at me as though she intended to remember what she saw, and I did not think she intended to remember it in order to complain about it later. I should, I told myself, introduce myself properly in the morning, ask her actual questions, behave like a person rather than a document. The thought had an air of the stable door latched well after the horse has departed. I set down the untouched brandy. Before I had quite decided to do it, I found myself walking out of the study and down the long corridor that ran through the heart of the house. past the portraits of ancestors whose eyes I knew better than their histories, past the closed door of the blue room that had been my father's, and which I had not opened since his death, through the main gallery with its high windows and the pale moonlight coming in at a long angle across the floor, and into the east wing, where Lydia's apartments had been prepared over the past several weeks by Mrs. Hale, who takes preparation for guests seriously to the point of artistry. The hour was, I noted with a certain dry clarity, approximately 11:30. My vow of distance had lasted 9 hours, of which I had spent 7 in my own wing staring at accounts I wasn't reading. I stopped outside the sitting room that adjoined her bedchamber. Light showed under the door, a warm amber light, not the thin line of a single candle, but the fuller glow of a fire built up and a lamp or two lit. She was still awake. I knocked. A pause, the sound of movement within, not startled movement, simply someone rising from a chair. Then, calm as weather, "Come in." She was sitting in the armchair by the fire with a book open in her lap. She was wearing a plain wool wrapper over her nightgown, the wrapper the color of old moss, and her hair was loose about her shoulders, the same warm chestnut, but longer than I had registered, falling to her shoulder blades in a loose wave. She looked up at me with an expression of composed inquiry, as though I had arrived at a reasonable hour for a reasonable purpose, and waited. I stood in the doorway. "I apologize," I said, "for the hour." "It is not particularly late," she said, with the complete absence of irony that I was beginning to recognize as characteristic. I stopped. I am not accustomed to not knowing how to say things. I have spent most of my adult life saying exactly what I mean in the fewest possible words, and I find silence and precision better than elaboration. But standing in the doorway of my wife's sitting room at 11:30 on the night of our wedding, I discovered that I did not know how to begin. I realized I had been somewhat abrupt earlier. She considered this with the same quiet thoroughness she seemed to bring to everything. "You were clear," she said, "which is not the same thing, but it may be more useful." I found myself, to my mild surprise, stepping into the room. "What are you reading?" She turned the book slightly so I could see the spine. A volume of Pliny's Natural History, thick with use, the spine worn along the outer edge in the manner of a book read many times. The text on the page, I could see from where I stood, was in the original Latin. "You read Latin," I said. "I do," she said. "My father's clergyman taught me, on the theory that there was no reason a woman should not have access to the same texts as a man, which was an unusual view for a Shropshire parson, but a welcome one. He had 6 daughters and believed they ought to be educated. His youngest learned Greek as well." "And what do you make of Pliny?" "He is not always right," she said, "but he is never dull, and his confidence in his own wrongness is almost admirable." She paused. "He has a great deal to say about wolves that does not survive contact with actual wolves." I found myself, to a degree I had not anticipated, wanting to hear more of this particular line of inquiry. There was a second armchair on the other side of the fire, angled toward hers. I looked at it. She followed my gaze and did not say anything one way or the other, which I interpreted as neither objection nor encouragement, and sat down in it. She marked her place in Pliny with a folded slip of paper, and set the book on the small table beside her, and we sat for a moment in the firelight with the wind off the moor coming in at the gaps in the window casements and the fire burning steadily between us. And I thought, with some surprise, that this was the most genuinely comfortable I had been in a room with another person in a very long time. "I should tell you something about the house," I said. "I would like that." The house is larger than it appears from the approach road. There are 43 rooms in current use and another 20 that are closed off and have been for about a decade. The household consists of Croft, who is my steward and has been for 15 years and is the most competent man I have ever employed. Mrs. Hale, the housekeeper, who runs the indoor staff with an efficiency I have never had occasion to question, 14 indoor servants, and 12 outdoor, including the head gardener and his 2 sons. The moor to the north of the house is mine as far as the River Werne. The farms to the south and east are tenanted, 11 of them on leases of varying ages. The village of Varnmore is 2 miles east, a church, a school, a mill that has been running since my grandfather's time, and approximately 300 souls. She listened to all of this with evident, active attention, not the attention of politeness, but the attention of someone who is actually learning the landscape and filing the information in useful order. "And the closed rooms?" she said. "My father's collection, paintings mainly and some furniture that suited his tastes and does not particularly suit mine. I paused, considering how to put it. He had a generous relationship with acquisition. He bought things because they were offered to him by people who knew how to offer things to a duke who liked being flattered. Some of what he bought was genuine, some was not. I have not found the occasion or the will to address the question of what to do with the contents." She was quiet for a moment. "Perhaps," she said, with the complete absence of self-promotion that I was beginning to understand was simply how she said things, "that will be something I could assist with." I looked at her. "Perhaps," I said. We talked for more than an hour. I cannot now reconstruct the exact sequence. There was no grand transition, no deliberate decision to have a conversation rather than a polite exchange, and then leave. She asked about the shipping concern because she had overheard Pemberton mention it earlier in the evening, and found herself curious about how a landlocked northern estate came to have interests on the Atlantic trade routes. I explained it. My grandfather's arrangement with a Liverpool merchant family, the ships built on the Tyne, the routes running sugar and textiles outward and bringing back various imports, the complexity of managing it from this distance with agents in Liverpool who were efficient but occasionally optimistic about their projections. She asked good questions, not the decorative questions that people ask when they want to demonstrate interest without actually having it, the questions designed to make the speaker feel important and intelligent while communicating nothing. Actual questions, with follow-on implications, the kind that can only be asked by someone who has absorbed what was said before and understood the structure of the problem. She asked about the relationship between the Atlantic trade and the estate income, and whether the two balanced each other's cycles, and I told her they did in principle, and that the difficulty arose when both went wrong simultaneously, which had happened in my father's last years, and was the origin of the arrangement with the Renworth family. She nodded, and I could see her working out the figures in her head. "You have some facility with accounts," I said. She glanced at me. "You heard that from Pemberton." "No, from the way you're thinking right now." A pause, then she said, carefully, without any particular emphasis, "I managed my father's estate accounts for the past 3 years." I stopped. "His household accounts." "His estate accounts," she said in the same level tone. "Sir Aubrey has a generous spirit and a poor head for figures. My elder sister Cecily has excellent taste and no interest in columns of numbers. The task fell to me, as the tasks that fall into that category of things that need doing which no one else will do generally do." "How old were you when you began?" 19, a pause. "The estate was already in some difficulty by then. I managed to stabilize it for several years, and I believe I improved the position of the smaller tenants in particular. But there were debts that predated my involvement significantly, and the interest on them was not something I could, well." She did not finish the sentence. She did not need to. I understood precisely what the unfinished sentence contained. She had watched an estate fail not because of any failure of her own, but because the damage had been done before she arrived, and the interest was inexorable, and the resources she had to work with were not sufficient to address the problem at its root. She had done everything a competent person could do, and it had not been enough. And then she had been contracted into a marriage as the solution to the problem she had not created. And she had accepted the contract and picked up Pliny's Natural History, and was reading it in Latin when her husband of 9 hours knocked on her door. I was very still. "Miss Renworth," I said, and then corrected myself immediately. "Your Grace." The faintest twitch at the corner of her mouth, the first I had seen. "Lydia will do, I think." "Lydia," I said, "I owe you an apology." "For which particular thing?" "For the way this was arranged," I said, "and for I should have asked your name sooner. I should have asked it in September when Pemberton first raised the matter. At the latest, I should have asked it when the papers were drawn. I asked it this morning, which was late enough to be," I searched for the word, "discourteous." She was quiet for a moment. The fire settled, sending up a brief bright rush of sparks. In the firelight her face was soft, and the gray of her eyes was the color of early morning light before it decides what it wants to be, and she was looking at me with an expression I could not parse with any certainty, not anger, not forgiveness, not the particular wounded look I had braced myself to encounter. Something more complex, something that seemed to be still assessment, as though she had not yet decided. "You could not have arranged it differently," she said at last, in a voice that was entirely without bitterness, which was more difficult to hear in some respects than bitterness would have been. "You needed what the arrangement provided. My family needed what it provided. The blame, if we are distributing blame, belongs more to circumstances than to persons." She paused. "What I would ask is simply that you not make the mistake again of treating me as a document to be filed." It was said quietly, without heat, and it landed with the precision of a statement that has been composed, in some private interior workshop, over a period of considerable thought. "I won't," I said. "Good," she picked up Pliny, then she set it down again. "Edmund." "Yes." "What do you actually like? Not the estate, not the shipping concern, not the accounts. What do you find worth having in the usual run of a day?" No one had asked me that question in a very long time. Possibly no one had ever asked it quite that directly. I thought about it, not a performance of thought, actual thought, looking at the interior of my own days with the same honest attention she was bringing to the question. "The moor," I said, "early morning before the household is awake. There is a ridge about a mile north of the house where on a clear day you can see the coastline. It is perhaps 8 miles as the crow flies, but on those mornings when the air is right, you can see the dark line of it against the sky. I go there most mornings, not for any productive purpose, simply to go." She looked at me. Something shifted very slightly in her expression, not quite a smile, but its antechamber. "I would like to see that." "I'll take you tomorrow," I said, and I meant it as I said it, which was not always the case with things I said. She looked at me steadily for a moment, as though taking the measure of whether I meant it. Then she said, "All right," and then, "Good night, Edmund." "Good night, Lydia." I walked back through the long gallery and the main corridor to my own wing, and stood in my study with the untouched brandy still on the desk and the more still silver outside the window. And everything was in the same position it had been 2 hours before, and yet something in the room or in me had moved a fraction. Just a fraction. Not enough to name with any certainty, but enough that I noticed it. I went to bed. I took her to the ridge the next morning. We left the house at 6:30 in boots and heavy coats, while the household was barely stirring, and the kitchen chimney was only beginning to show smoke against the dark gray sky. The frost was still hard on the sedge, and the path wound north through heather that was the color of old iron in the early light. She walked beside me without comment or complaint. She was a good walker, I noticed, sure-footed, unhurried, with the particular gait of someone who walks for the purpose of walking rather than the purpose of exercise. She did not fill the silence with speech for the sake of filling it. That was, I was beginning to understand, characteristic. We climbed the long rise of the ridge in silence, and at the top I stopped and pointed southeast, toward where the coastal line was just visible in the early light. A thin, dark definition at the edge of the sky, 10 miles distant, barely distinguishable from the cloud. She stood beside me and looked for a long time without saying anything. The wind was cold and persistent, coming in off the sea, and she had turned her collar up and her hands were in her pockets. The light was doing what the light does on the northern moors in October, moving through grays and silvers with no concern for prettiness, simply showing you the world as it is. "I can see why you come here," she said finally. "The light is different every morning," I said. "I have never seen it the same twice." She turned and looked at me, a quick, assessing glance of the kind she deployed sometimes when I had said something that interested her, and then looked back at the view. "No," she said. "I imagine not." We walked back in the same quiet, and at the door she said she was going to look at the closed rooms if I had no objection, and I said I had none, and that she should ask Mrs. Hale for the keys, and that whatever she found she should feel free to catalog or rearrange or simply examine as she saw fit. She nodded and went in, and that was the beginning of the months that followed. I will not pretend, telling this story, that those months were a smooth or uncomplicated progression. They were not. I am a man who had lived inside his own defenses for 20 years, and the habits of a defended life do not dissolve overnight simply because an honest woman sits across a fire and asks you what you like. There were weeks when I retreated entirely into the study and the accounts and the correspondence with the Liverpool agents, emerging only for meals, speaking in monosyllables over the soup while she watched me with those gray eyes in a manner that was neither demanding nor reproachful, simply attentive. There were evenings when I was curt in ways that had nothing to do with her and everything to do with old patterns of behavior. The reflex of a man who has learned to manage everything by keeping people at arm's length. And she would look at me and say, with the same level directness she brought to most things, "Edmund." "What is it?" And I would find myself answering, which always surprised me, because the question was asked without pressure and I could have not answered. But somehow the lack of pressure made not answering seem unnecessary. There were also the library evenings. The library at Varnmore had been, for the decade since my father's death, a room I largely avoided. Too many of the books were his. My father was a man of considerable charm and considerable weakness, and I have never entirely sorted out the memories of him into clean categories of affection and grievance, and rooms that hold the residue of an unresolved relationship tend to be rooms I prefer not to enter. But Lydia had found the library in her first week and taken it over with the same quiet efficiency with which she approached everything she found useful, and by November it was transformed. The shelves organized, the dust gone, a fire lit every evening. Several volumes ordered from a bookseller in York arrived and shelved in a section she had designated for recent natural philosophy, and a table in the center of the room where she worked on various projects simultaneously. She was cataloging the paintings in the closed rooms. This turned out to be a substantial undertaking, involving correspondence with dealers in London and Edinburgh, and the consultation of reference texts she had identified through the bookseller and obtained through Pemberton, who had begun, I noticed this with some satisfaction, to address her correspondence with the alacrity he reserved for matters he considered important. She was also, it emerged gradually, teaching herself botanical illustration. She had learned the rudiments from an aunt in her girlhood, and set the practice aside at 16 when the estate demanded more practical applications of her time. She was resuming it now with the focus of someone who has been waiting some years for the occasion. I started coming to the library in the evenings. Not immediately, not until the second week of November, when I found myself walking past the closed door 3 evenings in succession, hearing the small sounds within, the scratch of a pen, the occasional turn of a page, once a faint sound that might have been her humming something under her breath, and then simply opening the door on the 3rd evening because standing in the corridor considering whether to open it was beginning to seem, even by my own standards, an excess of caution. She looked up from the catalog notes and said, with no preamble whatever, "The Bellini in the second room is genuine. Pemberton's man from Edinburgh confirmed it this afternoon. The Flemish hunting scene beside it is not." "My father was proud of the Flemish hunting scene," I said. "I know. I found his correspondence about it in the estate archive. He paid considerably for it." She set down her pen. "Shall I tell you who sold it to him and what that dealer's actual reputation was among the London houses?" I sat down in the chair across from her. "Please." This was how the evenings went for the rest of November and into December. She with the catalog or the botanical drawings, I with a book or the correspondence, talking sometimes and sometimes sitting in a silence that had become, over the weeks, something I did not want to break because the quality of it was too good to disturb. The silence of two people who are comfortable enough in the same room to be quiet in it is a different thing from the silence of two people who have run out of things to say or who are maintaining a polite distance, and I had not experienced the former variety in a long time. I learned things about her in layers over those evenings, not through any concentrated disclosure, not through anything she announced. She was not, I understood early, a woman who narrated her own history for the benefit of an audience. But over time, in the way that details accumulate when you pay attention, I learned. She had wanted to study at Edinburgh when she was 17. There had been a scheme, briefly, involving a sympathetic cousin of her mother's who had some connection to a physician who lectured there, and a course in natural philosophy that she had been told admitted, on very rare occasions, serious women students. It had come to nothing when the finances failed sharply in the year she turned 18, and every resource that might have been redirected toward her education vanished into the management of a more pressing crisis. She spoke of this without rancor. She spoke of most things without rancor, not because she had suppressed any, I thought, but because she had made an authentic peace with the things that could not be changed, in the particular way that people do who have had to make that peace early and under pressure, and have therefore had more practice at it than most. She had two close friends in Shropshire, a clergyman's wife named Mrs. Aldwick, who had apparently been the person she talked to most reliably and honestly for years, and a woman who ran a small circulating library in the market town, and she wrote to them regularly and received their letters, which she did not show me but which clearly mattered to her. I made a note, in the part of my mind I use for managing things that require future action, to ensure that the postal arrangements at Varnmore were efficient, and that any letters addressed to the Duchess were treated as a priority. She had a sense of humor I had not detected at first because it was entirely dry, delivered in the same quiet, level tone she used for everything else, so that the first several times she was actually funny I missed it, and the fourth time I caught it, and she saw that I had caught it, and the corner of her mouth moved in that particular way, not quite smiling, but the thing that is made of the same material as a smile. In December, two things happened that changed the shape of what we were becoming. The first was a letter from my cousin Hartwell, who is a man I have known since we were boys at school together, and who is one of 3 or 4 people on earth whose opinion I have ever genuinely valued. The letter informed me that he and his wife Arabella would be spending 3 weeks at Whitfield Hall, which is Hartwell's family property in the southern part of the county, and that Arabella had conceived a series of Christmas gatherings involving a considerable number of people, and that I was expected to attend at least one, and to bring my wife, about whom Arabella had already heard through channels Hartwell declined to specify and was deeply curious. I showed the letter to Lydia over supper. She read it through carefully, in the way she read everything, not quickly, not performing comprehension, but actually reading. "Do you want to go?" she asked. "Not particularly. I find large gatherings," I paused, "tiring." "But Hartwell matters to you." "Yes." She set the letter down on the table beside her wine glass and was quiet for a moment, thinking. Then she said, "Then we should go." She paused. "What is Arabella like?" "She is warm, intelligent, and constitutionally incapable of leaving an interesting situation alone," I said. "She will have questions." "About us," Lydia said, "not a question. About the nature of our arrangement." "I see." She looked at the letter again, briefly, then back at me. "What would you like me to say if she asks directly?" I found that I could not immediately answer that question. What I would have said, if I were being entirely honest, was that I no longer knew what the nature of our arrangement was. Civil, the word I had offered her on the evening of our wedding, was still accurate in certain technical senses and entirely inadequate in every other sense. The word described none of what had actually developed over the past 3 months, which was something with considerably more texture and specificity than civility. The morning walks to the Ridge, which she now came on regularly, and which I had come to think of as better with her present. The library evenings, which I had begun to come to not because I needed to be in the library, but because I needed to be where she was. The particular quality of the silence between us. The way I found myself, in the middle of managing something administrative, thinking about what she would say about it. The way I had started, without consciously deciding to, consulting her about things, not because she insisted, but because her observations were invariably useful and occasionally decisive. "Tell them the truth," I said at last, "that we are managing." She looked at me steadily for a moment. "Managing," she said. "We are doing more than that," I said, which was perhaps the most honest thing I had said to her in 3 months, and which seemed, from the quality of her gaze, to have been received with the weight I had intended. "Yes," she said quietly, "we are." The second thing happened the week before we were to leave for Whitfield Hall. I came down to the library at 9 in the evening and found Lydia not at her usual place at the catalogue table, but in the armchair by the window with her knees drawn up and her face turned away. And it took me a moment, 3 or 4 seconds of standing in the doorway, to realize that she had been crying. Not crying now, recently. She had the particular stillness of a person who has been crying and has decided to stop and has very nearly succeeded. The eyes a little too bright, the set of the jaw a fraction too deliberate. I stood in the doorway. She turned and saw me, and there was a brief flash of something across her face, embarrassment first, and then the deliberate reassertion of composure, the quick internal gathering of herself. And then she said, in a voice that was only slightly less even than usual, "Forgive me. I didn't hear you come." "Don't," I said. She blinked. "Don't what?" "Don't put it away for my benefit." I walked across the room and sat down in the other chair. I did not ask her to explain and did not offer anything in the way of comfort that was not simply my presence in the chair, which was, I had by now learned, generally the thing she actually wanted rather than words. She was not a woman who needed to be reassured or talked through things. She needed occasionally not to be alone. We sat for a while. The fire burned steadily. The wind off the moor moved in the chimney. Then she said, "I had a letter from my mother." I waited. She writes to tell me that my father's health has declined further. The money from the settlement has helped with the immediate situation, and the largest creditors have been managed. But there is a problem with the tenancy on the East Farm that predates my time managing the accounts, and that no one in the household knows how to address. My mother writes to me because I am the one who would know, and because she has no one else to ask, and I am here. She stopped. Started again. "I am here," she said quietly, "and I cannot fix it from here, and I am aware that being here was the right decision for my family and for other reasons, but sometimes I miss what I was." She paused. "I miss being the one who could fix things." There was a particular quality to those words. Not self-pity, which was never an instrument in her repertoire as far as I could determine. Simply fact, delivered with the honesty she brought to everything. What I was. She had been in Shropshire the competent center of a struggling household. The person the household oriented toward when something needed doing, the person who knew where to apply the lever. She had been needed in a particular and specific way, and the loss of that specificity was real, even in the midst of a life that had acquired other dimensions. "Tell me about the tenancy problem," I said. She looked at me. "Edmund." "You know how to solve it," I said. "Tell me what it is and we'll write to your mother tonight." There was a silence. Then she told me, a dispute over the lease terms on the east-facing farm, a long-standing disagreement about improvements and who bore their cost, a tenant who was in the right by the letter of the original lease, but lacked the documentation to support his position, and a landlord's agent who had been taking advantage of that absence of documentation for several years. She laid it out in the ordered, efficient way she had of presenting complicated situations, and as she talked I could hear her composure restoring itself, hear it in the voice, in the way she sat forward rather than huddled against the window, in the return of precision to her language. By the time she had finished, I had the shape of the solution clearly, and she had arrived at it at the same moment. "He needs the original lease copy," I said. "Which will be in the Shropshire County Record Office," she said. "The family solicitor will know how to apply." "We'll write tonight." We wrote to Lady Renworth together. I drafted the practical section, the steps, the solicitor to contact, the specific wording that would be most useful to invoke, and Lydia wrote the personal section, which took her rather longer and which she did not share with me in draft, simply sealed with the rest. Then she read my section back to me and made 2 small corrections that were, I acknowledged, improvements, one of phrasing, one of substance, and we sent the letter with the morning post. That night when I rose to leave the library and she walked me to the door in the way she had fallen into the habit of doing, she said, "Thank you, Edmund," and put her hand on my arm. Just for a moment, just a brief, light pressure of her fingers through the wool of my coat, not a grip, simply a touch, and then she stepped back. I walked back through the gallery to my own wing and stood in my study and looked at the place on my arm where her hand had been. And I understood, with the particular clarity that arrives not as a surprise, but as the confirmation of something that has been building for a long time, that I was in considerable difficulty. I was in love with my wife. I had not intended this. I had not, in the arrangement I had made with such efficient practicality in September, intended anything of the sort. Had in fact built specific structures against it, set conditions, established distances, framed the whole enterprise in the language of legal obligation and material provision, precisely because I had recognized, somewhere below the level of conscious decision, that this was the kind of situation in which a man could get into difficulty if he were not careful. And here I was in December, 3 months in love with a woman who had arrived with a strand of pearls and a worn copy of Pliny, and had proceeded without effort or design to make herself so quietly essential to the texture of my days that the thought of her absence made the house feel, even in imagination, gray and too large, and without sufficient reason. The problem was the promise I had made her. Civil distance, the East Wing and the West Wing. I had told her precisely what she was walking into, and she had accepted the terms with the same equanimity she brought to everything, and she had met them with a dignity that made the whole situation worse. Because she had never pressed for more, never maneuvered for closeness, never made her situation pitiable or my withdrawal guilty-making. She had simply gone on being exactly who she was, with such entire consistency, and in doing so had dismantled, without trying to, every defense I had spent years constructing and maintaining with considerable effort. The question was what she felt. I had no reliable evidence. She was warm in her manner, attentive in conversation, entirely comfortable in my company in a way that no longer felt like the management of an arrangement and very much like genuine ease. But she was those things by nature. She was warm with Croft, attentive with Pemberton, comfortable with Mrs. Hale in a way that had clearly made Mrs. Hale, who took her time in forming attachments, very much attached. I could not use her warmth toward me as evidence of anything particular. What Hartwell had said, or nearly said, before I stopped him was different. She glances at you, he had begun when she thinks you're not watching, but I had not let him finish the sentence. I would not press her. The arrangement I had made her had been a promise of a particular kind of life, and she had built her understanding of what she was entering on the basis of that promise. The least I could do, the least I owed her, was not burden her with a feeling she had not asked for and might not welcome. She was managing a new household, a new county, a new role, while also managing the anxiety of her parents' situation at a distance. The last thing she needed was her husband arriving with unwanted declarations. I would go to Whitfield Hall with her, and I would be what she had asked me to be, more than civil, as I had said. I would be a decent husband, and a present one, and a useful one, and I would not impose on her the thing I had discovered about myself in the library chair. We traveled to Whitfield Hall 4 days before Christmas, in the large closed carriage, with 2 of the household maids and Croft in the second conveyance behind. The journey was 3 hours through the frost. Lydia brought Pliny, and a volume of botanical taxonomy she had recently acquired from the York bookseller, and did not read either of them. She watched the countryside through the carriage window with the intent attention she gave to most things, and occasionally said a word or two about something in the passing landscape. A stand of birch trees that interested her, a mill wheel working against the current of a frozen stream, a farmhouse she recognized as a pattern of architecture she had not seen in Shropshire, and I responded, and the 3 hours passed in what felt like considerably less. When we arrived, Arabella Hartwell was at the front door before we were properly down from the carriage. Arabella is a small, quick-moving woman of 35 with the kind of energy that fills a room by intention and cannot be turned off. She had been Hartwell's wife for 12 years, had borne him 3 children, and had never in that time moderated either her curiosity about the people around her or her willingness to act on it, which was simultaneously one of the things I found most admirable about her, and one of the things I found most alarming. She embraced me with the enthusiasm she always brought to everything, and then turned to Lydia with the expression I recognized as Arabella in the early stages of assessment, welcoming and searching simultaneously. "Your Grace," she said, "I am so very pleased. Francis has told me so little, which I have come to understand, means there is a considerable amount to discover." Lydia looked at her steadily. "I shall try," she said, "to be worth the investigation." Arabella blinked, and then laughed, a genuine, entirely unguarded laugh of delight. "Oh," she said, as though something had just been confirmed for her. "I see." And she took Lydia's arm and led her inside with the purposeful warmth of someone who has already made a decision, and Hartwell appeared at my elbow as the carriages moved away to the stable yard. "Well," he said quietly, "she is not what I expected." "No," I said, "she isn't." He was quiet for a moment, watching the door through which they had disappeared. "Edmund, don't. I haven't said anything. I know what you were going to say." "I was going to say," he said, with the patience of a man who has been my friend for 30 years, "that she glanced at you twice on the drive, in the 30 seconds I had to observe her, with an expression I would describe in a person whose marital history I did not know," as he paused, composing the sentence carefully. "Fond." I stopped walking. "I am simply," Hartwell said, "making an observation." "Leave it alone," I said. "Entirely your affair," he said serenely. "I want a drink, come inside." The fortnight at Whitfield Hall was unlike any fortnight I had spent in a considerable number of years. Arabella had assembled approximately 20 guests, family, near neighbors, 2 artists she patronized, a scholar from the university at York, and a retired admiral named Blackmore who had known my grandfather. And the house was warm and loud and active in the way that large house parties in December are, with movement through the dining room and the drawing room and the long gallery at most hours, people in and out of each other's conversations, the noise of children in the upper stories. I am not easy in this kind of company. I manage it. I have the capacity for social navigation that a man of my position requires. But it costs something, and I am aware of what it costs, and I generally limit the duration accordingly. Lydia, I discovered over the first 2 days, was very good at it. Not in the practiced, artificial way of someone working hard at making an impression. In the same quiet, attentive way she managed everything. She listened with genuine attention. She asked questions that made people feel heard and taken seriously. She was honest without being blunt, warm without the cloying quality that makes warmth exhausting. When she chose to be funny, which was rarely and well-timed, it was exactly pointed enough to land without drawing blood. By the 3rd day, the other guests had oriented themselves around her. Not because she claimed attention or dominated conversation, but because she was interesting to be near. Because conversations that included her tended to be more interesting than those that did not. Because she had a quality of engaged presence that most people find they want more of. The retired Admiral Blackmore spent the better part of an entire dinner at her side talking about the Atlantic trade routes, with the kind of animated enthusiasm he usually reserved for matters of naval strategy. He sought me out afterward and said, with the solemnity of a man delivering important intelligence, "Your wife has an unusually sound grasp of tonnage, Varnmore." I said that she had managed an estate for 3 years. He nodded as though this explained everything perfectly and then added, "Damned fine woman, damned fine." Arabella cornered me on the afternoon of the 4th day. She found me in the small sitting room off the library, where I had retreated with a review of the shipping accounts, and she sat down across from me without preamble and folded her hands in her lap in the manner of a woman who has decided to say something and is not going to be deflected from saying it. "Edmund," she said, "you are in love with your wife." I set down the accounts. "I have been watching you for 4 days, she continued, before I could say anything. "You track her across every room she enters. When she is not in the room, you are not distracted, but less entirely present. You are, for the first time in my 14-year acquaintance with you, not the most watchful person in any given gathering, because too much of your attention is occupied with her." I said nothing. "Frances told me she glanced at you twice when you arrived," Arabella said. "I have seen her do the same thing at the dinner table and in the drawing room yesterday and in the gallery this morning." She paused. "Edmund, have you told her?" "The arrangement we made." "The arrangement you made in September is not the arrangement that exists in December," she said, with the particular emphasis of someone who considers the point self-evident and is mildly exasperated to have to make it. "The arrangement you made was a legal and domestic contract. What exists now is rather more than that, and you know it." "I know what I feel," I said. "I do not know what she feels." Arabella looked at me for a moment with an expression I could not categorize as either sympathetic or impatient, but which seemed to contain elements of both. "Has she given you any indication," she said slowly, "that she wishes to maintain the distance you proposed?" I thought about the hand on my arm, the gray eyes in the firelight, the way she had said when I told her we were doing more than managing, "Yes, we are," the twice she had apparently glanced at me in the drive. "I don't know what she wishes," I said. "Then I suggest," Arabella said, standing and smoothing her dress, "that you find out." She looked at me with the expression of a woman who has said what needed saying. "Edmund, she is not a problem to be managed at arm's length, and you are not a man who is indifferent to her. Act accordingly." She departed. I sat in the small room for a long time with the accounts unread and the fire burning down. On the evening of the 5th day, there was a musicale. The pianist, a young man from York whom Arabella had engaged for the occasion, had considerable talent and an evident enjoyment of the instrument that communicated itself to the room. The guests assembled in the main drawing room, which had been arranged for the purpose, chairs and settees in loose groups facing the instrument. The lights turned low around the edges and concentrated at the piano, candles in the chandeliers giving the room a warmth that the December cold outside made pleasantly intense. By some sequence of movements I did not entirely plan, I found myself seated beside Lydia. She had a light shawl around her shoulders, and her hair pinned up with several strands at her temples doing what they always did, and she sat with her hands folded in her lap, and her face turned toward the pianist with the expression of someone actually listening, not performing attention, actually attending to the music. Between the second and third pieces, in the small silence while the pianist arranged his notes, she said quietly, without turning her head, "You're not listening to the music." "No," I said. "What are you listening to?" I had several possible answers. I chose the simplest, honest one. I was thinking about something Arabella said to me this afternoon. She turned then and looked at me directly. What did she say? The pianist began the third piece, a Clementi sonata, slow and careful, with a melodic line that moved through the room like something that wanted to be heard and insisted on it gently. I looked at Lydia's face in the candlelight, the clear gray eyes, the determined jaw, the small scar at her temple, and I made the decision. "She told me I should tell you something," I said. "And will you?" "Yes, not here," I paused, "when this is over." She looked at me for another moment, and then turned back to the pianist, and I watched the set of her shoulders. The way she had accepted that answer without pressing, settled into the music with the patience she brought to everything. And I thought that patience of that particular quality, given freely and without calculation, is one of the most difficult things in the world to be worth of. When the musicale ended and the guests began to move, to find their coats, to drift toward the supper table, I put my hand at the small of her back. The first time I had touched her with any intention beyond what the wedding required, and said quietly, "Walk with me." She rose and came with me without asking where we were going, and we made our way through the dispersing guests and down the east corridor to the small morning room at the far end, which was dark and empty and had a window looking over the frozen garden. I lit the lamp on the mantelpiece. She stood in the middle of the room and faced me, entirely steady, waiting. "I told you," I said, "on our wedding night what I could offer and what I couldn't." "Yes, I was wrong. Not about the material things, those I have given and will continue to. I was wrong about the distance." She was very still. "I proposed a distance," I said, "that I have already entirely failed to maintain. I told myself I was maintaining it, and I was not. I told myself I was being careful, and I was not. What happened instead over the past 3 months is that I found myself occupied. Persistently and increasingly occupied with a person who reads Pliny at 11 o'clock at night, and corrects tenancy letters with genuine improvement, and walks a ridge in October with the same attention she brings to everything else. And I have been making a considerable effort not to say anything about this, because I made you a promise, and I was not going to impose on you with something you had not asked for." She said nothing. The lamp burned between us. "What I feel is not civil," I said. "It is not manageable in the sense of being put in order and filed correctly. It is I am not, as you may have observed, at my most articulate about things that are not factual, and this is not factual, but the substance of it is that you are the most real person I have encountered in a very long time. The most genuinely, specifically, consistently real. And the library is a room I cannot be in without wanting you in it. And the ridge in the morning is a place I could go alone and choose not to. And I do not know exactly when those things became true, but they are, and you deserve to know." The lamp flickered once in a draft from the window and steadied. Then Lydia said, "Edmund." "Yes." "Do you remember the evening in the library when I had been crying?" "Yes." "I had been crying," she said, with the careful precision she used for things that cost her something to say, "partly about my mother's letter, and partly about I had spent 2 months becoming increasingly aware of something, and aware simultaneously that the terms of our arrangement gave me no standing to say it, and that to say it would be presumptuous, a violation of what you had offered." She paused. "You were clear about what you could provide, and I had accepted that, and I did not. I did not think it would be fair to want more than what had been offered." I was very still. "I have not been particularly good at managing what I feel about this," she said. "I am good at managing accounts and correspondence and the catalogue of 43 paintings in varying states of attribution. I am less reliable when it comes to—" She made a small gesture with one hand, the gesture of a person indicating something they have difficulty containing in words. "This." "What is this?" I said. She looked at me. "A man who came to my sitting room at 11:30 on his wedding night because he wanted to know my actual thoughts," she said. "Who took me to the ridge the next morning because he said he would and meant it. who sat with me on the evening I had been crying and did not say a single useful word and was exactly right, who wrote half a letter to my mother about a Shropshire tenancy problem and asked me to write the other half. A pause. Arabella told me, she said, this afternoon that you had been watching me at the musicale. She told me the same thing about you, I said, that you had glanced at me in the drive when we arrived. Twice, she said without apology. She stopped, started again. I was looking at you to see if you were glad to be here. You are not always easy to read. No, I said, I am aware of that. You were glad, she said, I could tell. She looked at me steadily in the lamplight and then said, Arabella is a thoroughly meddling woman. She is, I agreed. I owe her considerably. The corner of her mouth moved, and then the corner moved all the way into an actual smile. A full, warm, open smile with something that looked very much like relief in it, and something that looked very much like happiness. And it was, without contest, the most valuable thing I had seen in that room or any other for a very long time. I crossed the space between us and put my hands on either side of her face, and she tilted her face up, and I looked at her for one moment, the gray eyes, the 3 months of mornings and evenings and library chairs accumulated between us, and then I kissed her. It was not a performance. It was the most honest thing I had done in years, and when I drew back, she was looking at me with an expression I recognized because I had felt it on my own face. Something between relief and arrival, the quality of having gotten somewhere you had almost stopped expecting to reach. For the record, she said, I was reading Pliny on our wedding night because I was frightened. I thought if I occupied myself very thoroughly you would, she paused, that you would leave me to my own devices and I would be able to manage the situation from a distance, and that would be all right. I was very nearly prepared for that to be all right. I knocked on your door at 11:30. You did, the smile again, quieter now but no less warm. I was very glad. I told you I would take you to the Ridge, I said. And you meant it, that was the first thing, she paused. There were many things after. We stood in the morning room with the frozen garden outside and the lamp warm between us, and everything in the room was the same as it had been 20 minutes ago, and everything was entirely different. The vow, I said, the one about keeping my distance. Yes. I broke it on the first night, in all the ways that mattered. You did, she said. I noticed. She looked at me steadily. Edmund. Yes. I would like, she said, to be your wife. Actually your wife, not civilly. The word civil had been between us for 3 months, small and precise and inadequate. She returned it now with its full weight reversed, and I understood what she was offering. Not a renegotiation of terms, but an abandonment of them, in favor of something that did not have a neat legal name. Yes, I said, I would like that too. We returned to the drawing room in time for the supper, and Arabella, seeing us come in through the door, gave me one swift, satisfied look of a woman who does not require thanks, because the evidence before her is sufficient. We returned to Varnmore 2 days into the new year, in a carriage that felt entirely different from the one that had traveled south in December. Lydia slept against my shoulder for the last hour of the journey, both volumes still unopened in her lap, and I sat very still so as not to wake her and looked out at the northern landscape coming back, the moors, the frost on the sedge, the ridge against the sky in the distance, and felt, for the first time in longer than I could accurately account for, the particular quiet of a man who has arrived somewhere. The months that followed were the work of building what we had found at Whitfield Hall into the daily fabric of a life. Not easy, not always smooth. I do not tell it that way because it would not be accurate. I am not an easy man to live with. I know this. I am private in ways that require adjustment from those who live close to me. And there were moments in the early months of that year when the habits of my defended life reasserted themselves without warning, and I would close off in the middle of a conversation, or retreat into work at an hour when work was the wrong answer. And Lydia would not demand anything or press against the closure. She had more sense than that. But would simply wait in the library with the lamp lit until I came back to myself and came to find her, which I always did. She was also not without her own silences. She had been alone in many important ways for a long time, and there were things she did not share easily, not from distrust, but from the long habit of carrying her own weight. I had to learn, over time, the difference between the silences she wanted interrupted and the ones she did not, and getting it wrong at first was, I think, less damaging than it would have been with someone less honest. Because when I got it wrong, she said so, quietly and directly, and then we found our way past it. The closed rooms were fully opened in March, when the light was good. Lydia had completed the catalog over the winter, and we went through the paintings together one afternoon, working room by room, and she told me what she had found and what she thought of each piece with an eye I had not expected. Not the eye of a scholar, though she had read widely enough to have considerable reference, but something more instinctive, a sense of what a painting was actually doing, and whether it was doing it honestly. 3 of the 40-odd works turned out to be genuinely significant. 2 others we determined were worth restoring. The Flemish hunting scene my father had been proud of, we agreed, was a comfortable fiction that we would leave in a quiet corner and not discuss. One painting, a small landscape in oils, almost without human figures, showing a hillside in the early morning with the light coming at a low angle across a stretch of common ground, Lydia said simply, quietly, that she loved. I had it moved to the main gallery. She reorganized the estate accounts in the spring with the assistance of Croft and Pemberton, who by that time had both formed opinions of her that they expressed in the particular way of men of their generation. Not in words, but in the consistent efficiency of their response to anything she required. She found 3 structural inefficiencies that had been present in the accounting for at least a decade, not fraudulent, simply the accumulations of habit and underthought, and addressed them with the same matter-of-fact competence with which she addressed everything. The estate's net income improved measurably in the following year. Croft, when I mentioned this to him, said that he had had his suspicions about the relevant line items for some time, in the manner of a man who is both modest and pleased. In April, she wrote to her friends in Shropshire, and in May I arranged for Mrs. Aldwick, the clergyman's wife, to visit for 3 weeks. I had not mentioned to Lydia that I was arranging it. I simply told her one morning that a letter had been sent and that Mrs. Aldwick was expected on the Thursday. The expression on her face when I said this, a brief, involuntary moment of something that was almost joy and then composed itself into gratitude, told me that I had understood the situation correctly. Mrs. Aldwick arrived on the Thursday and proved to be a small, brisk woman of about 40 with an excellent mind and a willingness to say exactly what she thought, which I recognized as the origin of Lydia's own directness, and which I approved of accordingly. The 2 women spent 3 weeks in the library and on the moors, and talking at all hours in the way of people who know each other so well they pick up conversations mid-sentence. And in those 3 weeks Lydia was more herself, more entirely, openly herself, without the small reserves she maintained even with me, even at our best, than I had seen her in any concentrated period. I filed this information carefully and with gratitude. The tenancy problem in Shropshire was resolved in June. I had set Pemberton to work on it in January, quietly, through the proper channels, obtaining the original lease document from the county record office, establishing the correct legal interpretation, writing to Sir Aubrey's solicitor with the relevant argument. Lydia learned of it through a letter from her mother, who wrote with a bewilderment that was entirely endearing about the sudden efficiency of the proceedings. She came and found me in the study with the letter in her hand. "You arranged this," she said. "Pemberton did the actual work." "Edmund." "You told me about it," I said. "It seemed an obvious thing to address." She stood in the doorway for a moment, looking at me, and then she crossed the room and sat on the edge of my desk, which was a thing she had begun to do in the past several months and which I had come to find, without comment, entirely right. She looked at me for a long moment in the way she looked at things she was actually thinking about. "What?" I said. "Nothing," she said. "I was just looking at you." And she put her hand over mine on the desk, the same gesture as the night in the library, the same light, certain pressure. "And thinking," she said, "that you are not, in fact, the coldest man in England." "No," I said, "apparently not." She leaned forward and kissed me, with the quiet assurance she brought now to most things between us, and I put my hand up to her face, and the late afternoon light came through the study windows in long bars across the floor, and outside on the moor the heather was beginning to come into its summer color, and I had the thought, not for the first time that year, but with a freshness that did not wear, that this was what had been on the other side of the wall all along. In September the following year, our son Thomas was born. We named him Thomas Aubrey Caro Thomas for my grandfather, who had built the ridge path I walked every morning, and had been, by all accounts, a man of genuine quality. Aubrey for Sir Aubrey, who had cried for the second time in my acquaintance with him when we told him the name, and who had arrived the following month with Lady Renworth to see the child, and had been, for the duration of the visit, entirely and unguardedly happy in a way I found I respected. Lydia sat up in bed 2 hours after the birth with Thomas in her arms and her hair loose and her color high, and the expression on her face was the expression of a woman who has done something extraordinary and is entirely aware of it. I sat beside the bed and held my son and looked at my wife and felt the full accumulation of the past 2 years. The arrangement, the vow, the study window at 11 o'clock, the ridge in October, the library evenings, the hand on my arm, Whitfield Hall, and the morning room and the lamp between us. And I understood that all of it, every piece of it that had seemed merely practical or merely lucky or merely the consequence of having made a decision under pressure, had been tending toward this. Thomas asks now, as I said, how his parents came to be together. He has heard various versions. Croft's version, which he tells well and which emphasizes the orderliness of the arrangement, since Croft values orderliness. Lady Renworth's version, which emphasizes her daughter's good character, which is accurate but incomplete. Cecily's version, which she tells with briskness that does not quite conceal warmth. Arabella's version, which is the most entertaining and, in its emotional substance, the most accurate. He has not heard mine. Mine goes like this. I made an arrangement in September because I thought efficiency was wisdom and distance was safety, and the problem of the wall was not a problem at all, simply a reasonable architecture. A woman came with a strand of pearls and a copy of Pliny and the kind of quiet courage that does not announce itself, and she made no claim on me, demanded nothing, expected what had been promised and not one thing more, and simply went on being herself. She asked me what I actually liked. She corrected the letter about the tenancy with 2 improvements that were real. She sat in a library chair and was sad without apology, and it broke something loose in me that had been stuck for a long time. I knocked on her door at 11:30 on the night we were married, having made a solemn vow to keep my distance, because I could not go back to sleep without having spoken to her properly. She looked up from Pliny with gray eyes in the firelight and said, "Come in," and I came in. I broke the vow before midnight. It was the most useful thing I ever did. My mother told me I would look over the wall and find the world had gone on without me. She was wrong about the last part. The world had not gone on without me. The world, in the particular and specific form of one honest, clear-eyed, Latin-reading, dry-witted woman who understood accounts and Pliny and the ridge in October, and the precise weight of a hand placed once on a wool coat sleeve, had simply been waiting at the door, with patience I had not deserved and did not take for granted. I let her in. The ridge is better with her. The library is the room I most want to be in. The house that was too large and too managed and too carefully maintained in its careful silence is something else entirely now, loud with Thomas, warm with visitors, full of the sounds of a life that is actually being lived rather than administered from a careful distance. The coldest man in England, they called me. They had not yet met my wife. I have not told Thomas yet about the afternoon in November when the first snow came early and I found Lydia at the south window of the library watching it with an expression I could not read. And when I asked what she was looking at, she said, "I was trying to decide whether the North is beautiful or simply relentless." And I said, without thinking, "Both, usually." And she turned and looked at me and said, "Yes, I think that is also true of you," and I found I could not argue with it. I have not told him about the evening in late November when we sat on either side of the library fire, and she was drawing a specimen of moorland heather with the careful attention she brought to the botanical work. And I was reading a navigation report from the Liverpool agent. And at some point I looked up and realized that I had not turned a page in 40 minutes. Not because the report was uninteresting, but because watching her work, the focused tilt of her head, the precise movements of the pen, was a thing I preferred. I did not say this, but I set the report down and picked up a book and read it with the same attention I usually brought to accounts, which is to say, completely. I have not told him about the first time I heard her laugh, properly laugh, not the single brief unguarded moment at the supper table, but a sustained, full laugh at something her sister, Cecily, wrote in a letter that I happened to be in the room to hear. It was a sound I had not associated with her, because she was not given to obvious mirth, and it surprised me so thoroughly that I stopped what I was doing and simply stood there for a moment until she looked up, flushed slightly, and said, "Cecily has described a scene at the Ashford ball involving Lord Whitmore's hat and a potted palm." And I said, Tell me. And she read me the relevant paragraph, and it was, in fact, very funny, and I laughed. And she looked at me as though I had done something unexpected, which I may have done. These are the small things, the kind of things that do not appear in any document and cannot be reconstructed from external evidence. The accumulation of them over a winter and into a spring is what I mean when I say she made herself essential to the texture of my days, not through any dramatic act or any large claim. Through the steady, specific weight of being a particular individual person with particular and individual qualities, who is simply present day after day with enough consistency that the day without her develops a distinctive and unwelcome quality of absence. By the time we went to Whitfield Hall, I had been feeling that absence as a hypothetical, the way you feel the cold by imagining being without a fire rather than by actually going out in the frost. And I was aware of it with the clarity of someone who has recognized a vulnerability they did not intend to have. The vulnerability was not frightening, exactly. It was simply information, and I am a man who is generally better for having accurate information, even when the information is uncomfortable. What Hartwell said about the glancing, that she had done it twice in the drive, in the 30 seconds he had to observe, I turned over many times during those first days at Whitfield Hall between the gatherings and the dinners and the occasions when Arabella organized something involving everyone in the same room. I had not been looking at Lydia in the drive. I had been looking at Whitfield Hall itself, which I had not visited in 8 years and which was larger than I remembered. I had missed the glances. But Hartwell had been looking at Lydia, in the particular way of a man who is curious about whether his closest friend's new wife is going to require managing, or whether she is something more interesting, and Hartwell is a reliable observer. The question of what to do with this information was one I had resolved, as I said, in the direction of discretion. But resolved implies a settled peace with the resolution which was not quite accurate. I had made the decision not to say anything and I was maintaining it, but it was not costless. There were moments at Whitfield Hall, moments at dinner, or in the drawing room, or crossing from one part of the house to another in the company of 20 people who were all engaged in their own conversations, when I would look at her, and the effort of not saying anything was a specific, identified effort, conscious and maintained. She was, at Whitfield Hall, more relaxed than I had seen her at Varnmore. I thought at first that this was the effect of being among strangers, where the stakes of performance are different than they are in the domestic setting where she was still finding her footing. But watching her over those first few days, I revised this interpretation. It was not the strangers. It was the structure of a house party, which is a social setting where warmth and attention and the exchange of ideas are not incidental but the explicit purpose of the gathering. And in that setting, Lydia's particular gifts were not things she had to suppress or contain, but things the setting actively called for. She was suited to it in the way that some people are suited to the outdoors, not because she was unsuited to other environments, but because this one used what she naturally had. By the 4th day, she and Arabella had reached the kind of easy familiarity that usually requires a much longer acquaintance, which I attributed to the fact that both of them operated from a default of honesty and found the alternative inefficient. I would come into a room and find them in the middle of a conversation that might be about botany or estate management or the governance of Yorkshire parishes, with the same quality of engaged attention as though they had been having variations of the same conversation for years. The scholar from the York University, a man named Ellerton who worked on natural history, and had the absorbed, slightly distracted quality of people who are more present in their research than in their daily life, sought Lydia out on the 3rd day because Arabella had apparently told him about the botanical illustration work. He had brought a text on the classification of moorland plant species that he thought might interest her, and they spent an afternoon talking over it with the mutual absorption of 2 people who have found an unexpected overlap. And Ellerton appeared at dinner that evening with the look of someone who has had a pleasant and useful afternoon, which I found gratifying in a way I did not entirely analyze at the time. The Admiral Blackmore was a different kind of conversation. He was a man of about 70, broad, direct, with the manner of someone who has spent a lifetime in situations where manners are less important than clarity, and who found most civilian social occasions something to be navigated rather than enjoyed. He had known my grandfather, as I said, and his interest in the shipping concern was genuine and expert, and when he found that Lydia understood the Atlantic routes with the specificity that comes from managing the numbers behind them, He arranged himself comfortably in his dinner chair, and they talked for the better part of 2 courses about tonnage and victualling routes and the insurance structures that govern the Atlantic trade. And he was, in those 2 courses, more animated than I had seen him since he arrived. "Your grandfather," he told me later, when he had sought me out in the corridor between dinner and the drawing room, "was one of the finest men I ever served with, and he was a man who valued competence above all other things. I think," he said, "you have married correctly." This was an assessment I had arrived at independently, and which it was, nonetheless, gratifying to hear confirmed. On the morning of the 4th day, before Arabella had her conversation with me in the sitting room, I walked with Lydia in the frozen garden. Whitfield Hall's garden was more formal than Varnmore's, laid out in the geometric manner of an earlier century, with low box hedges and gravel paths and a central fountain that was still in winter, and had the look of something waiting for a different season. We walked the paths in our coats, and I was, in some part of myself that I was trying not to examine too closely, aware that we were walking closer together than was strictly necessary for 2 people on a gravel path, and that when her arm occasionally brushed mine, neither of us adjusted the distance. "What do you think of Hartwell?" I asked. "I like him," she said without hesitation. "He is very fond of you. It is evident in the way he talks about things that involve you. There is a particular quality to it, a care about the words." I considered this. We have been friends for 30 years. "That length is obvious, yes, but the care is not always." She paused. "He worries about you, I think, or he did." "Did," I said. "He appears," she said thoughtfully, not looking at me, "less worried now." I let this sit for a moment. Then I said, "Arabella will want to know everything." "She already does," Lydia said. "She has been quite skillful about asking it." "What has she asked?" "Whether I am happy at Varnmore." A pause. "Whether you are a difficult man to live with." "What did you tell her?" She turned her head and looked at me sideways, which was a look I had come to recognize as her version of amusement. "I told her that you are not easy, but that easy is not the same thing as good, and that easy was not what I was looking for." I absorbed this. "What were you looking for?" She looked away, back at the frozen path. "Someone who meant what they said," she said. "When they said it." We walked for another few minutes in silence. At the corner of the garden she stopped and looked up at the sky, which was the flat white of a December morning that cannot decide whether it wants to snow. "I am happy at Varnmore," she said, as though I had asked it then, which I had not. "In the ways that count." She paused. "I miss Shropshire sometimes. I miss what I knew how to do there. But I am learning what to do here, and the learning is—" She paused again. "It is good. The learning is good." I stood beside her and looked at the same flat sky, and thought that there were things I wanted to say that I was still not saying, and that the effort of not saying them was becoming very much like the effort of standing still in a strong current. The musicale that evening, and Arabella's conversation that afternoon, and the morning room afterward, these events followed in the sequence I have already described, and I will not retell them. What I want to say about the morning room, which I have not yet said, is the quality of the silence between us in the moment before I crossed the space between us. It was not a nervous silence. It was the silence of 2 people who have arrived at a place they have been approaching, without naming it as such, for some time, and who are both aware of where they are and waiting to see who will say it first. I said it first, in the particular way that it seemed appropriate for me to do, which was not gracefully or without difficulty, but with the directness that was the only mode available to me when something mattered enough. And she answered, as she answered most things, honestly, directly, and with a precision that made the words she chose feel exactly right. The winter that followed our return from Whitfield Hall, the first months of that new year, was the season in which we settled into what we actually were. Not the arrangement, not the version I had described on the evening of our wedding, with its careful allocations of space and distance. The real thing, which had been developing underneath those structures for the past 3 months, and which now had the room to be itself. It was not without friction. The habits of a person who has been managing alone, not relying, not leaning, not expecting to be caught if they fall, are not dissolved easily, even when the person is aware of them and is genuinely trying to let them go. Lydia had been managing alone in a more specific and longer-standing way than I had. She had been, in Shropshire, not only self-reliant but relied on, the one other people leaned on, which makes the releasing of that particular stance even harder, because the stance is not only about self-protection but about identity. She was not accustomed to asking for things. She would manage a difficulty quietly and entirely on her own before it would occur to her to mention it to anyone, including me, not from secrecy, but from the deep-grooved habit of someone who had been the solver in their household, and had not yet reconfigured herself as someone who might also, on occasion, be the one who needed solving. I noticed this. I learned to notice it without comment, to observe when she was carrying something I could help with, and to offer the help in the form of a question rather than an observation, because she responded to questions and sometimes grew briefly, quietly closed when she felt observed. This is a distinction that sounds small and is in practice the difference between being useful and being intrusive, and I am proud of eventually, not immediately, but eventually, getting it right more often than I got it wrong. For my part, I had the inverse difficulty. I was accustomed to not talking about things that were difficult, which she had learned to recognize by a particular quality that came into the set of my jaw and which she named once with a directness I appreciated. "You have gone inside, Edmund. I'll be here when you come back." The naming of it did not fix it, but it gave us a shared language for the thing, which made the thing smaller than it would otherwise have been. By March, the friction was not gone, but it had taken on the quality of friction between two people who have decided to stay in the same place and are therefore investing in learning the specific shape of each other's edges, not to sand them smooth, but to know where they are and move accordingly. This is, I have come to believe, the actual work of a marriage, not the finding but the learning. The finding is a single event. The learning is the rest of the time. Spring came late to the northern moors that year, late enough that I was beginning to think it might not come at all. And then it arrived all at once in the second week of April, the heather beginning to show green at the tips, and the birds coming back to the ridge, and the air losing its particular quality of iron cold, and becoming something that could breathe. Lydia and I walked the ridge on the morning of the 11th of April and stood at the top in the early light, and for the first time in 6 months we could see the coastline clearly, sharper than I had seen it in years, the line of it precise against the sky. "It's very clear," she said. "The air sometimes clears at this time of year," I said. "It moves differently in the spring." She stood and looked at it for a long time. Then she said, "I have been thinking about the East Farm." "Ours or your father's?" "Ours," she paused. "The lease on the eastern boundary doesn't expire until next year, but the terms as written don't address the drainage question adequately, and when it comes to renewal we should—" She stopped herself. "I am sorry. This is not what you come to the ridge for." "Tell me about the drainage question," I said. She looked at me, then she told me, and we stood at the top of the ridge in the spring light and talked about land drainage and lease terms for perhaps 20 minutes, and it was genuinely not a departure from what I came to the ridge for. The ridge was not a place I came to escape things. It was a place I came to see clearly. And this, standing beside her, talking about something practical and specific and important with the particular ease of two people who are thinking together rather than at each other, was the clearest I had felt in a very long time. Thomas was born that autumn. I have told the circumstances. What I have not told is the moment, after the birth, when the doctor and Mrs. Hale had both been in the room and had both, after a time, withdrawn, and I was sitting beside Lydia's bed with Thomas in my arms, and she was looking at me with eyes that were very tired and entirely clear. "Edmund," she said. "Yes. He has your jaw." I looked at Thomas, who was asleep with the complete, absolute authority of a person who has just accomplished something enormous and sees no reason to be awake about it. "He has your eyes," I said. "Gray is not distinctive," she said. "Half of England has gray eyes." "You're gray," I said, "specifically." She was quiet for a moment. The lamp by the bed was turned low, and outside the autumn moor was dark and windless, and in the room there was the sound of the fire and the small sounds of my son breathing. "Edmund," she said again. "Yes." "I am glad," she said, "that you knocked on the door." I looked at her. "So am I," said. She reached out and put her hand over mine on the bed frame. The same gesture, the same light, certain pressure, recognizable to me now as hers, as specific to her as her handwriting or the sound of her step on the library floor. "Thank you," she said, "for coming in." Thomas slept on in my arms. The fire burned steadily, and I thought, yes, this is what was on the other side of the wall, not the world going on without me, not absence. This, my son breathing and my wife's hand on mine, and the moor outside and the ridge in the morning, this is what my mother meant me to find. I had found it by going in through a door at 11:30, against a vow I had made before I knew what the other side of the vow contained. It was, I have always thought since, the right violation. There is one thing more I want to say for Thomas's benefit, and then I will set down the pen. He knows, he has grown up knowing, that his father is a particular kind of man. Not always an easy one. Not always a man who shows what he feels in the ways that most people show things, through volume or expression or the easy release of warmth. He has seen me in the study at 7 in the morning and at 9 in the evening, absorbed in something that needed absorbing. He has seen me cross a room at a dinner party to stand beside his mother when she was caught in a conversation she did not want, and steer the conversation elsewhere without drawing attention to the intervention. And he has noticed this because Thomas notices things. He has seen the way his mother looks at me from across a room, the particular look, steady and specific, that she reserves for me and that I have been receiving for 11 years now, and which has never lost its quality of significance. He has asked about it once. He was 9. He said, "What does mother look at you like that for?" I thought about how to answer. "She is checking," I said, "whether I am all right." "Are you?" "Usually," I said, "usually, yes." He thought about this for a moment, in the way he thinks about things, carefully, with the same unhurried attention his mother brings to the things that matter to her, and that I recognize as mine in the set of the jaw and the willingness to be quiet long enough to actually think. Then he said, "Do you check on her?" "I try to," I said. "How?" "I pay attention," I said, "to what she doesn't say as much as what she does." He considered this too. Then he said, "That seems like it would take a lot of work," and went back to whatever he had been doing, and I let him, because some things are better concluded and then returned to later, when the mind has had time to do what it does. He is right that it takes a lot of work. He is wrong not that he said it, but that it could be construed as a reason against it. The work is the point. The work is what the thing is made of. My father, who is many things I have not attempted to be, believed that the most valuable relationships in life were the ones that required the least of you, that a good marriage was one that ran efficiently with minimal adjustment from either party, like a well-run estate or a ship on favorable winds. He had several such arrangements in his life, and none of them did him any particular good in the end. What I have had for 11 years is something considerably more demanding, and I would not trade a day of it. When I look back at the man I was in September of 1831, sitting across from Pemberton with the settlement papers in front of me, saying, "Draw up the papers," before I had asked a name, I am looking at someone I recognize but do not particularly admire. Not because the decision was wrong. Sometimes arrangements made under pressure and for practical reasons resolve into something no one intended, but because the man who made that decision had reduced the whole transaction to its mechanical parts and declined, as a matter of deliberate policy, to consider what a person was. What a specific, particular individual person in a specific and particular situation might be bringing to the door he was about to close. Lydia brought plenty and competence and dry wit and the courage to be sad without apology and the restraint not to want what she had been told she could not have, and the grace not to resent me for telling her she could not have it. She brought more than that, which I learned over the years that followed. She brought the patience to let a difficult man find his own way to what he wanted, and the honesty to name what she herself wanted when he found his way there, and the steadiness to build something real on the foundation of an arrangement that had been designed to be anything but. That steadiness is the thing I want Thomas to know about his mother. Not the competence, though the competence is formidable. Not the learning, though she has read more widely than anyone I know and has continued to add to it. The steadiness. The quality of remaining, absolutely and consistently, herself, under the pressure of a strange household, a new county, a difficult husband, a reduced set of freedoms, a distance from the people and the work she had known, remaining herself without apology and without performance, and in doing so becoming over time the person around whom the rest of us orient. She once told me early in our second year that she had learned as a girl that the most useful thing a person could be was reliable, that her father was not reliable, and that her mother depended on her in the way you depend on what is reliable, and that she had decided early that whatever else she might be, she would be the thing people could count on. I had listened to this and thought about my own version of the same lesson, the wall I had built, which was also a kind of reliability, a reliability of absence and distance. And I had said to her, "It cost you something." She had looked at me and said, "Yes, and you." "Yes," I said, "and me." We sat with that for a moment, in the library, with the fire between us, which was a room and a setting so familiar by then that it had become simply where we went when we wanted to be where we went. "I think," she said, "we may have each been reliable in the wrong direction for a long time." "Yes," I said. "And now we are being reliable in the right direction." "Yes," I said. "I think so." She picked up the botanical drawing she had been working on and looked at it critically, tilting it toward the lamp to examine the line. Then she set it down and said, "Good, that is sufficient." It was exactly sufficient. It was the whole of what I had needed to hear, and the whole of what she needed to say, and we went back to our respective occupations, and the fire burned, and the moor was dark outside, and the house around us was quiet in the way that a house is quiet when it is full of the right things. Thomas has my jaw and his mother's eyes, and he asks good questions and waits for real answers, and is, at 12, already more patient than I was at 30. He will be all right. He has had good examples of what reliable looks like when it is pointed in the right direction. This is my account. I have not made it prettier than it was, or larger than it was, or faster than it was. It was ordinary in many of its parts. A man who made an arrangement and a woman who accepted it, and a winter in the north, and a library, and a ridge in October with the coastline visible in the early light, and a lamp in a morning room at the end of a corridor in a large house where two people had been approaching something without naming it for months, and then named it, and then came home. Ordinary, and yet, as I hope I have conveyed, not for a moment small.